Okay, contrast and affinity. So we're going to continue on with the Bruce Block book. I should see if I have any videos in this. Am I going to have to download this or not? I don't think so. Okay, I can keep it on the cloud. Okay, so this is, again, talking about the Bruce Block contrast and affinity book. It's in the syllabus. The visual story is the actual title of the book. I think of it as the contrast and affinity book because that is the theme. So let's talk about this a little more thoroughly. On Monday, we talked about the visual actors like tone, shape, color, contrast, space, line, that sort of thing. Now let's go a little bit deeper. So controlling the player experience through tension and release. Okay, so what's cool about this is that even though we're talking about environment art, this does actually apply to everything, this contrast and affinity concept. So affinity means just similarity, okay? Contrast is difference. And just the rough 1,000-foot view of this is that when we have lots of affinity, it's comfortable and nice and that sort of thing. And when we have contrast, that creates sort of tension, therefore excitement. That's the 1,000-foot view. Like if you take nothing else from this, take that, okay? And you'll have a decent understanding of some of these things. And so let's take a look at some examples of this. So when you look at these two photographs here, they're both action shots. They're both, I think they're both kendo. At least the one on the right definitely is. But they're both, some sword fighting type of thing. So when you look at, they have equal amount of action, I would say, but the first image has a lot more contrast in it, right? The second image has a lot more affinity. It has what we would call tonal affinity, right? Whereas the first image has tonal contrast. And therefore, that first image has a lot more excitement to it, even though, there's really the same amount of action being applied. I mean, heck, you even see some blurring of motion here. This first image could even just be a pose. In fact, it probably is just a pose, but it seems more exciting, again, I think because of the contrast. All right, so every element can be manipulated in this way, right? We have spatial contrast, which for level design is one of my favorite types of contrasts and affinities to exploit here. And of course, most of you, because this game is massively popular, know this opening scene, from Breath of the Wild, where you get this amazing spatial contrast. And yes, this is almost a whammy bar thing at this point to do something like this, but it's so effective. Why not do it, right? You're in the little cave, and then you go out into the massive world. Obviously, that is tremendous spatial contrast, right? And that's exciting and cool. And is often utilized. We see this all the time. We saw this even in the Resident Evil Village example that we looked at earlier, where you're in the tiny little house and eventually you look out into the vast village, right? So we see this type of spatial contrast all the time because it works. It's effective. And the thing is, yes, it almost sounds maybe slightly derisive when I keep calling these things whammy bar things, my own personal nomenclature for sort of cliches, but they're effective, and there's no reason not to use things that are, effective. All right, so linear contrast and affinity. So when we look at these images, we could see that there's a difference in contrast and affinity with them. So there's more kind of visual rhythm here in this kind of row of columns. Okay, so we have a certain amount of linear affinity here versus the spiral pattern, which again, there's sort of both happening in the spiral pattern. I mean, you have an affinity because it's a pattern, but because they're not straight lines, we have contrast in that in that way. Okay, so contrast of depth. And this is, I think, quite important in a lot of games, and actually very, very important, I think, in the games that you're making right now, the shooting, the action games that you're developing. So when we have this foreground, right, that gets established, and then you have the background. And when you look at both of these examples, Metal Gear Solid 2 and Gears of War, we actually have a lot of affinity in like lots of other things. So it's really important to have a contrast of depth We have in both shots, I think, a tremendous amount of affinity in color and tone. And so depth is really one of the only contrasts you're getting in these screenshots. And I think that's especially apparent when you are kind of peering down these narrow corridors, right? It's very easy to see, oh, here's the foreground, and that contrasts with the background. And it's also important to understand these are all illusions that we're making, right? Because, scientifically or empirically speaking, these are both just flat planes, right? They're just screens that we're looking at that are just completely flat. And it's a trick of color and perspective and art that even makes us think that there's any depth at all, right? So depth of contrast of depth, very important, I think, in any game where you're going to be shooting things from a distance. Okay, so hue contrast. Of course, this is Mirror's Edge, which did this very, very well. They put all this affinity in kind of the background elements, but high contrast in the gameplay-oriented environment objects, the things you can do parkour moves on. And it was very effective at kind of teaching the player where they can go in the environment, and also very clever as well, because you're thinking about if you've ever played Mirror's Edge, which is now quite an old game, you're really having a game here where the character movement was pretty revolutionary, and actually kind of still is. There's not a lot of games that have done what Mirror's Edge has done with its kind of free roaming first person parkour. And so when you have a game environment where you can move around in ways that you're not used to as a player, it's actually really important to highlight to the player what exactly are legitimate objects that you can parkour on, climb on, grapple, and all of that. So they use this contrast and hue, and then as kind of a bonus, they get the excitement, the visual excitement of that contrast kind of along for the ride. So it's sort of being done for gameplay reasons, but you get a cool environment effect as well. So another way to think of this is pacing, right? And this kind of goes back to when we talk about intensity curves in our action games. Not making sure that we're not overtaxing the player by making the level pure action from beginning to end, having these moments of rest. So contrast and affinity plays into that principle as well. And so yes, here's again going back from the earlier lecture example of a intensity curve in a game. In visuals, it kind of works the same way. If you try to make everything have heavy amounts of contrast, it gets visually tiring. The same way that if you made an action game level that was pure action for 45 minutes, just unrelenting, it would get exhausting to the player. It's the same idea, right? We always want to balance the contrast and affinity. Usually, we don't want all contrast and no affinity, and usually we don't want vice versa either, unless we're going for something really, really chill. All right, so we have this, and if we think back to that, not Resident Evil Village, but Resident Evil Revelations, that particular lecture, there's definitely contrast and affinity from room to room in a game environment. We do have a rhythm that gets developed that way. And we see this whenever we're walking through a structure that has a lot of affinity in room types, right? When you go through a hotel room, each hotel room is going to be very similar, even if you're going from a larger, more expensive room to a cheaper room. They're going to look very, very similar until you get to, at least at nicer hotels anyway, some kind of atrium or lobby or sort of front area that's a little more grand and exciting and interesting. And so you do get that interesting affinity of rooms from room to room to room to a really exciting contrast if the hotel is nicer and has a grand lobby sort of area. And if you think about Resident Evil Revelations, we saw this since it was on a cruise ship. You saw very similar hallways, very similar rooms. We get to that dining room and we get a nice contrast in kind of room sequencing. So there's a lot of different ways that you can think about contrast and affinity. Pretty much any element that you can control can have this. Okay, so one of the nice things about storyboarding, it's not something I generally ask for in documents and things, but one of the benefits of doing it is that you can find opportunities for contrast and affinity, because sort of in the same way that when I talk about gameplay, And one of the reasons why I advocate for paper design in gameplay when doing game levels and so on is because once you get ideas out of your head onto paper, you can start to iterate on them. That's, by the way, something my freshman class, at least on the midterm exam, kind of struggles to understand a little bit. I'm always like, what's one of the purposes of a game design document? And they'll say to, lay out the rules of the game or whatever, which is kind of almost a tautology to say that. And I'm like, no, to iterate on the design, to start the iteration process, right? It's something I'm trying to get through to them. It's kind of the same thing with a storyboard. Once you get a story sequence out of your head and onto paper, however primitive your storyboards need to be, you can do this with stick figures if you have to. You can start to find interesting opportunities. You can start to analyze what you're doing and find ways to exploit the rules of contrast and affinity from shot to shot. Now, one thing to remember, it's easy to fall, at least for me, at least the way my brain works. One of the things that you may come out of this with is just thinking that contrast is the goal all the time. Like, I really want a lot of contrast because excitement's good. This is games, right? Affinity can be just as desirable. So don't think of this as just trying to find ways to increase the contrast all the time. Increasing affinity can be just as effective depending on your needs. In fact, if you don't have a lot of affinity, the contrast will be kind of rendered meaningless. So I'm going to go off script a little bit and tell you something that does bug me about modern game environment art. This is really something that I think is abused quite massively in AAA game environment art now, especially in industrial sci-fi type games, but you do see this kind of across the board. It's sort of what I like to call the greebleization of game art. What a greeble is if you think about the Millennium Falcon, you know how the Millennium Falcon has, and for hopefully that's still in the popular culture ethos that we all know this. The Millennium Falcon has all these bits and bobs on it, right? Just things on its surface. It's got this rough, very sort of, it's got a tremendous amount of textural contrast on its surface, right? And it's kind of what makes it exciting to look at. Now, there was a story reason for that. There was a legitimate reason it looks this way. It's because, well, it's this old ship that Han Solo and other people have modified a zillion times. And so it's got all these bits and bobs and doohickeys on it or whatever. But it creates a lot of visual excitement, right? We think about the surface of the Death Star. It's kind of the same thing. That's probably the birth of this, right? Those are called, in environment art sort of production slang, greebles. Okay, just these random bits that like if someone wanted to greebleize that wall, there'd be all kinds of pipes coming out of it and circuit boards that have no logical reason to be there and all these things, right? Well, this gets abused because this contrast is visually interesting and exciting, and it's like the easiest way to make something look like polished, right, is to greebleize it, especially again in science fiction, industrial type environments. And I actually have grown to really dislike that because I've worked in the industry. I've seen what artists will do is be like, I'm just going to throw a bunch of greebles up there. I don't know how to make this look good, so I'm just going to put pipes on the wall and circuits that go to nowhere. And it's so ugly. My favorite environment artists actually strive for things to look interesting and clean and consistent and logical and not just stressed. Because the other thing about the greebleization of everything is when you play, it has, I think, a negative effect on gameplay, because when you look at like the original Halo, and this, by the way, as much as I might have a bone to pick with Video Game Donkey on YouTube over his like Death Stranding review, he did do a video on this where I think he was quite right in pointing this out. Where like original Halo, it's not greebleized because the technology wasn't available to just greebleize everything, and so the hallways are so clean and easy to parse visually, and you can tell where the enemies are. And now when you play like modern sci-fi shooters, everything is so greebled constantly that it's like even hard to pick out enemies in the environment because it's just so visually taxing to look at everything. That's like a huge beef I have with the way game environments are made now. Way too much textural contrast, I think, not enough affinity. So don't forget about affinity. It's a really good thing. We're looking for a balance, not just all contrast. Okay, so what I wanted to do, because when I developed this, I'm really trying to go for things that are going to be practical for all of you, right? Not just not all of us are meant to be hardcore game industry environment artists that are like going into Substance Painter, going into Maya all the time, like really doing all that. A lot of us are into other things. And so, can these principles, as sort of theoretical and high minded and 1,000-foot view as they seem, could they actually help you when you're making your levels, even if you're not, you don't have all this mechanical art skill? Yes, I absolutely think they can. And so, I wanted to develop some examples here of this. So, here's a simple block out. Okay, this could be anyone's level, could be in any genre. Can we add more interest? So let's take a look at what we have in this already. So we have one contrast depth. That's it. Okay. We have a little bit of, I guess we do have a little bit of tonal contrast, since there is a little bit of shadowing, but it's not a lot. We have mostly affinity. We have affinity of shape, right? Because square hallway, square shape in the background, square doorway. We have certainly affinity of tone, which is partially, and hue, which is partially influenced by the fact this is a gray box, right? So there's some aspects of affinity that we're just going to have in a gray box. Okay. We have some affinity in rhythm as well, affinity of movement because there is no movement, and mostly affinity and brightness, except the very, very back here. Okay, so now we're going to try to increase the contrast in this scene here. So we have what I've tried to do is add a bunch of contrast. So we still have the contrast and depth before, but I wanted some contrast in hue. So notice there's it's kind of blue back here, sort of kind of reddish orange elsewhere, and there's more contrast in tone, deeper shadows in the back, contrast in shape. This is supposed to be, a stand-in for a person, right? I could have used the Unreal Mannequin, but now since this figure is in the foreground and we have one in the background, we do have a little bit more contrast in depth and shape and brightness as well. So we're trying to add just more contrast. So when we look at this scene to this scene, it actually, like, it's hard to believe, I think, that they're like actually basically the same environment, right? I mean, we've just made these are just like 5 minutes worth of changes, right? And we've already made the scene look a little more interesting. Now, what I decided to do is let's revise that. Okay, this is too much contrast now, right? I've gone too wild here. So I kind of took a step back and be like, okay, the hue contrast didn't actually look good. So we're going to remove that and we'll just have affinity in hue. That's fine. And so what we did is we just took a step back. We added all of these contrasts. And I'm like, okay, let's remove the contrast and hue. And now I think we have a nice unified scene. I think this is more interesting to look at. All right, and then finally, one more revision going from this one to this one. I didn't like how the light was hitting the background figure. I think it was sort of obscuring some of the contrast in depth that I was going for. So notice now this background figure is a bit more in shadow. So now we have a more obvious foreground and background, I think. And so as you work, especially, and of course, the one conceit of this is you probably should not be doing this in gray box stage, this kind of detail work. I just did it in the gray box stage for speed purposes to show how these principles can absolutely be helpful. But this is going to be very useful to you as you art up your levels, right? As you get your first, and Brantley in the labs will be helping you with this. When you pick your project to kind of get to portfolio visual quality, I would say once you get past that first or second art pass where you have textures on your walls or you've replaced them with static mesh walls, whatever you end up doing, and you kind of have that initial pass, you can start to maybe think about more and more these kinds of things, right? And remember, okay, the player controls the camera, except I guarantee in just about everyone's game, whether it's going to be your deathmatch or your immersive sim or your action game or whatever, you probably at least have some areas that are predictable in terms of what the player is going to see, right? And you can set up interesting shots, in those areas where you're pretty sure the player is going to look in that direction, at least, for a second. Okay, that's it for today. We are all done. You may go. Unless, of course, there are any questions, obviously. Everyone's like, I don't want to ask a question because then they're all going to have to stay because I asked a question. All right, I think we're good. Thank you.